Pokémon, Pokémon, Pokémon. This great franchise comprised of great video games, great TV shows, great card games, great a bunch of stuff, just a very enticing universe that you want to be a part of, has been the source of hate and controversy online for the past few years for very valid reasons. And I'm sorry if you saw the title of this video and thought this would be a negative hate video towards all the recent Pokemon generations and all that. If you know my channel, if you watched my previous videos on Generation 9, you know I actually love these games. You can check them out. There's a video essay, there's another analysis video focusing on the DLC. You'll notice through these videos, even just the titles, the fact that I pretty much, I am a huge fan of Pokemon Scarlet and Violet. However, we all understand that Pokemon is not necessarily in the best place from a technical standpoint right now. These games have been, for a good while now, suffering from a lot of development crunch and have been coming out very visibly rushed. And this usually either results in a game that is either very basic and kind of unoriginal, or it results in a game that's literally just unfinished and broken, which is the case of Gen 9, even though in that case I feel like all the creative ideas and the ambition comes through and makes it a very good, enjoyable experience for me. It's clear that these games are not coming out in a decent finished state, and I'm not gonna support that. The statement, I'm really happy with where Pokemon is right now, and I really think Pokemon should improve for some clear, obvious reasons, are not mutually exclusive. I can believe both of these things, and I believe both of these things, even though I'm really happy with Gen 9, and I really enjoy playing through it as an experience, as just, this thing that I enjoy, despite all of its very obvious technical issues, which I can look past. I still think Pokemon should fix that stuff, because that is, considering Pokemon is, the biggest freaking media franchise of all time, it's frankly unacceptable that these games are coming out the way they are. And even from just a fan base standpoint, it's so sad to see that people who would otherwise enjoy Pokemon are so fractured and divided over if the new games are good, if they're bad. Some people are really disappointed, some other people are not really disappointed. And it's a very complicated, divisive issue with no simple answers, especially because it's more complicated than just, damn, these guys don't care, the games are rushed. You can see even in the more basic games like X and Y, that there is a spark here. The developers, they want to make some good stuff, and it's very clear that at least from a creative side of things, Pokemon is not really that, bankrupt. Pokemon is not failing in that sense. It's just that these games are not given enough time, they're not given enough staff. It's kind of a result of the transition from portable 2D gaming to portable 3D gaming to now home console gaming with the Switch. Pokemon have had a lot of trouble keeping up, and the budget and the development time has not been able to be enough for that, which is kind of messed up, but it is what it is. That said, yeah, I did enjoy Gen 9, but it is exactly that love for these games that made me think about this and have this idea on how these issues could possibly be fixed in a less jarring way, in a way that would be sustainable for both the developers and the fans, and would, in my opinion, generate better games overall. So let's get into it. As most of you all know, Scarlet and Violet got DLC content, just like Sword and Shield, and at least the people who enjoyed base games Scarlet and Violet, people who weren't completely angry and unaccepting of it, really enjoyed the DLC as well. And it was generally, within the boundaries of, yeah, this is still in a very broken, glitchy game, was received very positively by fans and critics and whatnot. It was a good DLC, and by the end of it, I think a lot of us got really attached to the world and characters in Scarlet and Violet. You would see, around when the DLC finished, lots of posts, people being sad that you're gonna have to leave this world, that you're gonna have to leave these characters because, haha, next year we're getting a new Pokemon game already, and they're gonna put you on the shoes of a new trainer and make you start all over again, and people don't want to say goodbye. You can even say the epilogue, which I wasn't able to cover in the DLC video because it wasn't out yet. is basically a victory lap for the DLC story and the story of Scarlet and Violet in general. A lot of the best moments in that extra hour or so of gameplay were just having your player character hanging out with all the other rivals and stuff that you met throughout both the base game and the DLC, and it was just sort of like a fun, wholesome time. And I'll be honest, I actually had a lot of trouble playing through that. Not because I didn't enjoy it, not at all. In fact, the opposite. I was enjoying it so much for the stupidest of reasons. Every little cute dialogue from any of the characters that I really like just made me like pause and squeal like a little girl watching a live show from her favorite boy band or something. I was legit just acting stupid while playing it because, oh my god, she said the thing. Nimona said the thing. Look at her, she said the thing. So yeah, the DLC was really great, and also something that's a result of there being DLC in the first place was the waits between the releases of each DLC wave. And that wait was also really fun and interesting and kind of make the entirety of Scarlet and Violet feel like this long ongoing story, pretty much. We'd have these breaks where we would be able to speculate on what would happen next, and in general just be invested in the story. It gave us time to miss the characters before they showed up again. As much as I'm still kinda sad they relegated the base game rival trio to just the epilogue of the DLC, there was a very special feeling when I found out they were coming back and like, oh my god, I missed them so much. It has the same appeal as a long-running TV show, you know, those where fans will usually create theories on what will happen next and try to understand what's going on and all the mysteries and all the characters, and then a fan base will be built around that, and when the show finally ends, it's like this huge event because people have been invested in the story for so long. It's basically more or less that same feeling. As the DLC was coming out, it didn't feel like Scarlet and Violet was over, even though I already hit the credits. It felt like the game was still in progress, was still going through its overall story, and we were able to stay invested in that world throughout. And you might be seeing where I'm going with this. I think they should focus more on extended support for each game instead of pushing new ones so frequently. A lot of people talk about wanting a Pokémon MMO, and while I don't think that's necessarily the path to take, I think Pokémon can learn a lot from games like Final Fantasy XIV, which has been going on for 10 plus years and has only gotten better with time. I don't think we necessarily need that MMO aspect if it, you know, it's not feasible. Maybe it's just not feasible. I don't know how feasible that would be. It's probably a very complicated process to create an MMO and probably a very risky one, and maybe Pokémon just doesn't want to get into that field necessarily yet, but games like MMOs, and even stuff like mobile games and live service games, they never really die, or they usually take a good while to die. Okay, editing Ash here, just making a small little asterisk on that sentence. Of course, live service games and mobile games have like a terrible history of dying prematurely, and once the servers die, the game is just done. And being those free-to-play type deals with lots of microtransactions and just stingy mechanics to try to get you addicted and spend money. Please don't misunderstand me. I don't want Pokemon to do that. Thank goodness I haven't gotten into Pokemon Masters yet. That game horrifies me. I just want some more updates. I don't need this to be an actual live service game that will die eventually. Much less one that's very stingy with money and microtransactions. Please God, no. Whenever we get a game like that, there's a good chance they're gonna last years, and or even more so with constant updates and expansions and patches and new content, because that's how it is. Back in the day, before DLC and before the internet, games would usually just get lots of sequels. We have Mega Man 1, and then Mega Man 2, Mega Man 3, Mega Man 4, Mega Man 5, Mega Man 6. Those are all just the ones in the NES. And now we've had, I don't know, Fortnite for, what, 5+ years by now? Probably a lot more than that. I don't know. And people are still playing Fortnite. It's not Fortnite 2. It's not Fortnite the sequel, Fortnite the Revenge. It's just Fortnite. It's just gotten more stuff. And the game's still going. I don't think we need something as necessarily expensive as like a full-on MMO or like a live service game. But maybe a new mainline game every 3 to 5 years could be enough. Basically, I think they should do a new mainline game per generation instead of doing a new mainline game each year. Thank God we aren't doing third versions anymore. They realize DLC is basically that, but better for the consumer and to an extent for the company itself too. And that's more or less what I'm thinking of, but to a stronger extent. Of course, we would miss out on remakes, but I think it's kind of clear now, coming off of Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl, that Pokemon remakes aren't really sustainable at this point in time. I'm not saying I don't like them, or I don't like the idea of getting them. God, a remake of Gen 7, whenever that happens, I'd be the happiest child alive. But it's kind of obvious that developers don't really want to do remakes anymore. And it's just from a technical standpoint, it's kind of in this weird state where the expectations going into Pokemon games right now are still different ever since the jump to the Nintendo Switch. You can't really do 2D games anymore in the same way you could do on the 3DS and before. You know, like, yeah, 3DS games are visually 3D. Gen 6 still was, you know, in like a grid map and had like disproportionate character models and stuff. So it was easier for them to translate Gen 3 into Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire in a way that felt faithful, but also coherent with what the console they're putting it on can do. I think a lot of what the Diamond and Pearl remake suffered from was just, how do you translate these old-ass DS games to a $60 Nintendo Switch game in a way that looks acceptable for it? And in the end, Game Freak just decided to not do it and not try at all, and that's what got us to Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl. And they just decided to focus all that creative energy into Pokemon Legends Arceus, which is basically a wholly original game with some connections to Generation 4. I think if we're to get any newer remakes going forward, the best approach would just be to give them a little more time. We don't have to get them as a tradition like we used to. Every other generation we'd get a new Pokemon remake, because that, you know, that there was a precedent for that once. But considering the current landscape of how Pokemon is right now and where video game consoles are and all that stuff, I don't think remakes are necessarily impossible or a bad thing, but I think they should be more well thought out. I think we should be looking more towards reimaginings and the sort of game that takes longer to make and come out than, you know, your expected Pokemon remake that's coming out every 5 years or so. You know, there's stuff like, for reference, Final Fantasy VII Remake, even though that ended up being more of a reimagining by the end of the first part, whatever. The Resident Evil remakes. Remakes are great, but you see how they're remaking very old games and making them something completely new, and these remakes usually take a good while to come out. I think that's the approach they should take with Pokemon if they ever want to remake any more Pokemon games going forward. But I don't think we need a Gen 5 remake so soon. I don't think we need a Gen 7 remake so soon, especially if it's at the quality level of Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl. I think those games are mostly fine. We'd just be filling out a checklist at that point. What's the next one to be remade? Oh, I guess Gen 5, so let's do it. Gen 5 done. Now when's Gen 6 happening? I feel like if they ever want to do a remake, it should be like a special thing. I don't think we need to expect remakes like this always. That just kind of hurts the brand and development cycle, and that it leads to a Brilliant Diamond Shining Pearl situation where it was like clear the developers didn't want to do it. It was clear the developers didn't have much money or staff to do it, so they outsourced it for very cheap just to please the audience that wanted their remake to exist in the first place. And with that singular approach to each generation, where we get one new game per generation and that new game gets updates for 3 to 5 years until the next generation comes out and we get a new game, I think there's a lot of possibilities for making each game better and more unique and more special. With that kind of format, we'd be able to have long-running story arcs that take, you know, even years to finish, and we can keep the audience invested in the main story through that. And with that, we can have stories that intertwine with the anime and other Pokemon media smoothly. You know how back when the Pokemon Horizons anime was coming out, since it came out in an awkward time between the DLC and the release of the game, it was able to do some cool mysteries with Terrapagos and stuff, because Terrapagos wasn't really a thing in the games yet. I feel like they could do more of that. Set up a Pokemon or a character in the anime, have that happen in the anime, then boom, it appears in the game too, and we can have that like crisscrossing and just general exchanging of information and story ideas from game to anime to, you know, card game and even manga if that's possible. Just, you know, brand synergy between all the media Pokemon is a part of nowadays. Because back in the day, we usually have a game storyline, and once the game is done, we basically knew what was gonna happen for most of the anime, at least like the general structure. Thinking back in the, you know, the Ash Ketchum days, we'd have the Evil Team storyline kicked off. We usually know pretty much exactly what was gonna happen as far as like, okay, what's the villain's motivations, what's going on, which legendary are you gonna try to summon, and what are the gyms, what is the league, who's the Elite Four. It makes so every other media has to pull more weight to make itself more original, and in a way that's very separate. Something that I realize now with Horizons, where it is not as, you know, trying to directly adapt the games, but it's also exchanging info and ideas and introducing things first before the games, but then they introduce it right after. You could make an argument, if it wasn't for maybe the state of like Terrampagos itself, for example, that it could share a very similar universe to the game. That's something I talked about when I talked about the anime on my discussions with Moonbeam, is that when they went to Paldea and matched Nimona and Brassius and stuff, it felt like they just went to the version of Paldea that I saw in the games, and that doesn't extend just to the environments, but, you know, the characters and what's going on. It feels translatable in a way the anime didn't really beforehand, and I think that's kind of a result of, one, the anime just doing its own thing right now, but also the fact that it came out during the game's life cycle and could, you know, sort of share information with the game instead of just being a direct or indirect adaptation of the game. And just like how in each DLC wave we usually get a few new Pokemon that change up the competitive scene, and now that, you know, quote-unquote Dexit is a thing, we can be excited to see our favorite Pokemon come back in future games. That could be a way to make that whole Dexit issue a little less painful, because if we can expect a longer lifespan for each game, we can also expect that by the end of each game, we're gonna have most Pokemon. If we have, like, instead of 2 waves of DLC, we have like 5 or 6. And in these 5 or 6, they release more or less the same amount of Pokemon we got for each wave in Scarlet Violet. By the end of a game's life cycle, we would have a mostly full roster of Pokemon that would make the game really complete. Almost kind of like when Pokemon Go released with just Gen 1. Whenever we got new updates with newer generations, it'd be really exciting, like, oh, wow, now we have Gen 2, now Typhlosion's in the game, I want to get Typhlosion. I feel like they could really capitalize on that if they did a longer running game. And there's also the fact that the Pokemon brand itself isn't really foreign to this sort of ever-evolving formula. As I mentioned about the anime before, pretty much every other format of Pokemon media is always evolving like this. We always have new episodes for the anime coming out every week or so. We have new sets for the TCG always coming out during generations. We have a lot of the spin-off games and the mobile games, which are always getting new content and new updates. I mentioned Pokemon Go, but we also have, like, you know, the gacha game Pokemon Masters, which I'll not touch. But still, that's also an example of, like, the Pokemon thing, getting new updates and new stuff all the time and keeping you hooked with that. Even something like the competitive rule set for the games themselves, which is kind of separate from the main RPG adventure, but also kind of not. You know, it's a complicated relationship. In that, we are now getting these things called regulations, where every once in a while we'll get a change in what Pokemon are allowed and what Pokemon aren't. They're slowly adding more stuff alongside the DLC mons, and that's a way to keep that community alive and strong and going, because the meta is always changing, we're always getting new Pokemon, so you always gotta be up to date and you always have to study the game and know what's going on. And I feel like that could also be the case for the stories themselves, for the Pokemon RPG experience itself, where you're always coming back to see what's new and what's going on, and what's the new stuff they added, and all that cool shenanigans. Basically, it's only those main stories that aren't really doing this. They are the only thing that doesn't really follow up with this ever-evolving sort of strategy the Pokemon brand as a whole kind of follows. And that's kind of weird, because Pokemon has always kind of sold itself on its quote-unquote brand experience, so to speak. There's a reason they call VGC competitors trainers instead of, I don't know, players or something a little more usual like that in official announcements. For better or worse, they want to just stay tangled up in the world of Pokemon. It's more than just new stuff you can buy and enjoy once in a while, but as like a constant, ever-evolving, never-fading part of your life. Where if you are a Pokemon trainer, you are a Pokemon trainer, you're living this experience. That's how they get you, but it's also kind of fun as well. That's partially why they already do the yearly releases, so they can keep you stuck in that. And for as morbid as it can sound, there's a genuine like lifestyle enjoyability to that. It's fun to be called a trainer when you're competing in VGC. It's nice to be part of this thing where you're part of this fan community that's always interacting and always sharing about this new stuff that's coming out. You really do feel like you are part of something special, something bigger than yourself. As morbid as that sounds, depending on how you word it, it is nice, and it is something the Pokemon games could use more of, even. But seeing as said yearly releases are slowly crippling the quality of the games and dividing a fanbase that's supposed to be so welcoming and so wholesome, it only makes sense to focus on a few more infrequent games with constant, easier to make updates and a long life cycle. I imagine making a single game and making DLC with like the B team or whatever. You have an A team making the new game and the B team makes DLC for it for like 3 to 5 years would ultimately be a little more sustainable for the developers than making a new game every year. Like A team make a game, B team make a DLC, but then the A team is already making the new game for the following year, and it's always like it doesn't stop, it doesn't breathe. It must be genuinely terrible for the people working on it, especially when they're so talented, creative people who deserve to have more time to make these games and to make them as good as they can possibly be. Like honestly, there's already rumors going around on what the newest games will be, and I'm dreading stepping into the shoes of a brand new trainer again. Now that I'm so invested in Scarlet Violet, and I really enjoyed that release cycle of the DLC and being a part of it and being excited for it and really feeling like a part of that world, I don't want a new game. I don't want to start off as a new trainer with the professor welcoming you and your mom sending you off to go on your first ever Pokemon adventure. Haha. It's nice to be invested in this one little thing. I'd honestly take like a few more years of Scarlet Violet DLC if that were possible, and I'd pay more for it. I mean, I'd hope the game would be a little more stable technically, but again, for the story experience, I would just love that, and I feel like that would be better for everyone, because then you would be able to make these games a little bit more polished. But of course, this idea does come with some difficulties. One that immediately comes to mind is game balance. By the end of the DLC, Scarlet Violet Pokemon were already within striking distance of the level cap, but for a multitude of reasons. While lately, the developers have been exploring ways to change the adventure and exploration aspect of Pokemon games, the battle system has stayed largely the same for the longest time. The only time they really experimented with that, they made sure to make it a separate standalone game with a bunch of features missing, such as multiplayer battling, abilities, and whatnot in Legends Arceus. That game had a little bit of a different battle system, but it also basically made itself a self-contained thing that doesn't really interact with the other games beyond Pokemon transfers. And that's largely due to the way Pokemon in general as a game franchise works, with, again, Pokemon transfers, but also competitive battling and, you know, all the delicate underlying systems going on under the hood as far as how these games are made. It's very technically complicated to make any change to the battle system without like making this huge domino effect that affects the competitive community, that affects even stuff like shiny hunting and just transferring Pokemon between each game. So, you know, how do you figure out a way to make the games last longer without making drastic changes to the battle system? Well, the one thing that comes to mind for that would be making you use new Pokemon, or maybe even just level locking the content in the DLC, but either of these don't really sound ideal because they're kind of removing a bit of an aspect of what the Pokemon experience is all about and how it's supposed to be enjoyed. If you're unable to bring your older Pokemon to the next story, then might as well just make a new game. Not really, but maybe from the developer's experience or the game design experience, it would be the case. Otherwise, they feel like they could possibly make actual changes to the systems itself with either raising the level cap beyond level 100 or rebalancing how you get XP and how quickly you get XP, kind of like future-proofing the game balance for future DLC, but that also has some complications. But yeah, frankly, in practice, these are kind of the smallest of issues. Pokemon has figured out how to make transfers from Pokemon Go to mainline games work, even though they work in completely different systems. It is a huge question mark and something that would indeed be difficult to address. But come on, they have professional game designers. The idea is there. If they simply put enough effort into that idea, I'm sure they could figure something out. Even something as simple as just inviting the player to use new Pokemon while also allowing you to use your older ones if you want. Maybe you get into this new area of the map with a new DLC and you come in and they're like, oh, maybe you should start catching new Pokemon. Here's a new starter. Then if you want to transfer your old Pokemon back, you can also just do it. It's effectively how the new games already work, because after a little while, once the transfers start working for the new game, you can just transfer your old Pokemon into the new one and just blast through it with little to no concern to difficulty or game balance. Even still, most people don't do it. It wouldn't really be that much of a change. It'd just be a little difficult to send the message across. A big initiative like this, making the games last longer, would not simply be completely stopped in its tracks because of a simple game balancing issue that can be fixed in lots of ways. But that's about it for me. If you guys have any more ideas surrounding this concept, please let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear what you have to say, especially because this is a very rough, vague idea I've had while playing through and thinking about Scarlet Violet and how they could make these games better and have these experiences be a little bit more meaningful in general. But if you have any more ideas on how this could work or how this maybe wouldn't work, I'm always glad to listen to you in the comments below. Remember to leave a like if you enjoyed this video. In general, just give me feedback. I really want to make these videos better each time, so let me know what I can do, and see you guys next time!